All right, our next topic is the Great Depression, starting in 1929. So we're coming out of the Roaring Twenties, where life was good, people had money, people were buying things on credit, kind of living a luxurious lifestyle, and as far as the average American went. Um, and then, obviously, that's all going to come crashing down toward the end of 1929, and that's going to carry over into the 1930s. Our essential question, make sure you write it down in your notebook, top of your notes. But what were the causes of the Great Depression? There's four of them that you've got to be familiar with. Let's see. A variety of factors caused the economy to move from the prosperity of the 1920s to the severe depression of the 1930s. They were one, overproduction, two, speculation, three, shaky banking practices, and four, restricted international trade. We'll talk about each of those um, in a little bit more detail. So first, overproduction. The 1920s had witnessed rapid economic expansion as manufacturers made and sold new products like cars, radios, and refrigerators. Many consumers, however, lacked the money to buy these goods, so manufacturers were soon producing more goods than they could actually sell. Cause number two was speculation. In the 1920s, stocks soared in value. If you guys can remember from earlier, many people bought stocks hoping to get rich quick. This drove stock prices even higher. Each day, the speculative boom on the stock market saw more and more investing in Wall Street. By 1929, stock prices had tripled since 1920. Buying on the margin. In the 1920s, stocks could be purchased for a 10% down payment called a margin. The rest of the price was financed by a loan from the stockbroker. It was similar to making a purchase on the installment plan. The buyer paid only 10% of the stock's value and promised to pay the rest when they sold the stock at the end. If the stock's price fell, the purchaser was still responsible for the whole price he or she had promised to pay. As long as the stock prices kept going up, this was not a problem. But if prices dropped, buyers on margin often did not have enough of their own money to cover such losses. People also invested in real estate, with similar hopes of getting rich quickly. The frenzy of stock market and real estate speculation created an atmosphere of easy money. Third cause of the Great Depression were shaky banking practices. Banks generally collect money from depositors and then invest these funds in businesses. This enables them to earn money to pay interests on their deposits. The vast majority of American bankers in the 1920s were honest and they followed established banking practices, but there were some bankers who invested their depositors' money in unsound investments. The government failed to effectively regulate either the banking system or the stock market. Consumers also bought more than they could actually afford, so this vast overextension of credit made the entire American economy extremely vulnerable. And then the last cause was restricted international trade. American tariffs protected American markets, but they made it hard for producers to sell abroad since other countries retaliated by setting up high tariffs of their own. In 1930, President Hoover signed the highest tariff in U.S. history. The shrinking of world trade contributed to the Great Depression also. So the Great Depression, we see the four steps that are kind of the ball's rolling in the 1920s, and so it's one of those foreshadowing things. Like we can kind of see it coming, and then it finally starts in 1929 when the stock market crashes. Back in 1907, when the stock market started to turn downward, private investors like J.P. Morgan stepped in and bought stocks to keep prices up. On Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, stocks started moving sharply downward. People could not sell their shares fast enough. There was no one willing to step in and buy stocks to support falling prices. Top bankers did meet that Friday, and they tried to buy stocks above current market prices to try and stop the rapid decline in prices. Unfortunately, this action by bankers only delayed the collapse by a few days. October 29th, known as Black Tuesday, the dam burst. Stock prices fell faster and faster. and prices were soon at an all-time low. The market had officially collapsed. From Wall Street to Main Street. After the stock market crashed, corporations could no longer raise funds. People who lost their money in the stock market could not repay their loans or rent, leading to bank failures. Thousands of people lost their life savings. In this new economic climate, the demand for goods decreased. As prices fell, factories closed and workers lost their jobs. Demand was reduced still further, causing prices to fall even more. Other factories closed, and the country became caught in the grips of a vicious downward spiral. People could not pay their rent or their mortgages, and people lost their homes. There was no one to buy the foreclosed houses, and home prices plummeted downward. Without any kind of safety net, such as unemployment insurance, hundreds of thousands of American workers found themselves living on the streets or in makeshift shacks in shanty towns. The human impact of the Depression. The Great Depression was a national nightmare. During the 1920s, many Americans had started to equate their self-worth with their material possessions. When the Great Depression struck, people felt worthless. People waited for events to turn, spinning in circles as they fought for their daily survival. Businesses failed, farmers lost their farms, banks failed, and millions of people were out of work. There was no unemployment insurance or bank deposit insurance. Private charities were overwhelmed. People were homeless. People went hungry. Millions depended on soup kitchens and bread lines for their food. Writers and photographers like John Steinbeck and Dorothea Lange recorded the misery of the Great Depression. Mexican repatriation. The Immigration Acts of 1920s imposed quotas on immigrants from Europe, but not from Mexico or the rest of the Americas. Mexicans freely entered the United States so long as they passed a medical and literacy test and paid a small tax. Many came to escape the turmoil in Mexico caused by the Mexican Revolution. In the United States, they were generally willing to accept back-breaking work for very low wages. Many settled in barrios in California and Texas. In Texas, Mexican Americans were barred from attending white public schools. They also faced many other prejudices. With less demand for labor during the Depression, white American farmers were in desperate need of work and sought jobs filled by Mexican American immigrants. As public hostility to Mexican immigrants grew, it became more difficult for Mexicans to enter the United States. In fact, only 33,000 were granted visas for the entire decade of the 1930s, compared to 500,000 in the 1920s. President Hoover authorized a special Mexican Repatriation Act to send Mexican American immigrants back to Mexico. More than 500,000 Mexican Americans were forcibly sent back to Mexico during the Great Depression. Many of them may have been lawful American citizens who became separated from their families.